was a distance runner in high school, running track and cross country. In the off season, I would run 5 to 10 miles a day for conditioning purposes. We lived out in the country about 4 miles from the city of Heath, Ohio. Heath High School was the city school in our area, and we were the country school. We were rivals with each other. I sometimes would run on my routes into Heath and run through some of the neighborhoods just for a variety of different routes to take the monotony out of it. But I always felt a little self-conscious running through Heath neighborhoods wearing my Lakewood High School sweatshirt. They looked upon us, those students did, as country hicks. One March day, I ran that route, and on my way there, I passed by a farm. There was a loose goat standing out in the front yard, and that goat began to follow me. It was a billy goat. And I thought maybe I would get far enough away from his home territory that he would realize that he was drifting too far and turn around and go back. But that didn't happen. I kept running, and he kept running along with me. And so I tried to shoo the goat back, but he paid no attention. I yelled at him and tried to intimidate him with a loud voice, "Go home!" But he paid no attention to that either. I tried to turn him around and push him the other way, but he wouldn't take that nudge. Then I tried to run faster, thinking I could run away from him. Goats run pretty fast, and he kept up with me. About that time, we were entering into one of these city neighborhoods, a housing development, and I was even more self-conscious than ever because this goat was running right beside of me. I imagined people looking out their windows and laughing and saying, "Look at that Lakewood boy taking his goat for a run." I thought every house that I came up to, some teenage boy from Heath would come out and taunt me. "Hey, goat boy, are you getting trained for track season?" So I was getting a little irritated about that goat following me. I picked up a stick and I cracked him on the head between the horns. That was a mistake. It only made him angry. He lowered his head and charged at me, and his horns caught my backside as I tried to get away. Almost knocked me down. I had no choice except to accept that I had a new training partner now. After we'd gone a couple of blocks, a barking dog charged out of one of the yards, and that distracted the goat. When he turned to face his new aggressor, I took the opportunity to slip down a side street and make my escape. I don't know what happened to that goat, but I never ran that route again. One of God's greatest prophets went for a run. He made someone so angry that he came under attack and had to make an escape. His name was Elijah. Do you remember his story? About 900 years before the time of Christ, God called Elijah to prophesy for him. And he called him because the king of Israel had married a pagan princess from a neighboring country. And she wanted to replace the worship of the one true God of Israel with the worship of her favorite pagan deity from her homeland. His name was Baal. In fact, she killed or tried to kill all of God's prophets, and she was in the process of replacing them with 850 prophets to Baal that she had imported from her home nation. Her name was Jezebel. That name itself tells you a lot about the kind of woman she was. She was ruthless and immoral. Elijah's first mission was to go to the king with a message from God. He told the king that God was pronouncing judgment on the nation because he and the queen had led the nation astray into disobedience and immorality and idolatry. And as a result, he said, it will not rain for over 3 years. Can you imagine that? If it did not rain for over 3 years, crops would fail, grasslands would die, streams and wells would dry up, animals would starve to death, and human lives would be threatened. As God was in the process of bringing that prophecy to be, Elijah went into hiding. 3.5 years later, Elijah emerged because God was going to end his judgment. But he was going to do so in dynamic fashion. Elijah issued a challenge to the prophets of Baal, a duel between the gods. He proposed that they each build altars. They build an altar to Baal, and he would build an altar to God. And they would put wood on top of the altar and then a sacrifice on top of that. And then they would call on their gods to send fire out of the sky to light the wood and to consume the sacrifice. And Elijah said, whichever God answers that call will be the God of the nation. The prophets of Baal accepted his challenge. Elijah allowed them to go first, and they prayed with great intensity to Baal. They danced around the altar. They cut themselves with knives in order to show Baal their dedication to him. They called out loudly in unison, as if with one voice, calling for Baal to come down, Baal to respond. This went on for several hours, but there was no response. Then Elijah stepped forward. He alone faced all of those pagan prophets. And he had so much faith in God that he doused the wood on the altar with water. And he also poured water on the sacrifice. And then he prayed this simple 30-second prayer, asking God to demonstrate to everyone that he was the one true God. And immediately, fire fell from the sky. And it ignited the wood on that altar, and it consumed the sacrifice. Elijah had won the challenge. The people who were all gathered to watch broke out in praise of God. Elijah took advantage of this turned tide, and he urged the people to put to death all of those 850 false prophets. And they did. It was a smashing defeat to Baal worship. Jezebel was not there. She hated the prophet so much she would not attend the worship service. But King Ahab was there. Elijah told him to get in his chariot and head back to Jezreel, to his palace. And he said, hurry, or you're going to get caught in the coming rainstorm. Then Elijah began to run, and he ran all the way to Jezreel, 35 miles away from where they were on Mount Carmel. 1 Kings 18:46 says that he ran in the power of the Lord, and that power enabled him to run ahead of Ahab's chariot and beat Ahab to Jezreel. Wow. Evan, this spring in track, next fall in cross country, you run in the power of the Lord. Cut your time. When the king got back to the palace, he told Jezebel what had happened. But instead of being convicted and repenting, she became even more hateful and obstinate. And she sent a message to Elijah which said, may the gods deal with me severely if I don't end your life by tomorrow. And Elijah felt more threatened by that one woman than he did by those 850 pagan prophets that he had faced. He ran again, this time in fear. And when he could run no longer, he collapsed beneath a tree and asked God to take his life. Elijah was distraught, discouraged, and depressed. The battle that he had fought had taken its toll emotionally. That happens to us, doesn't it? You have been there. Whatever you have battled, if it's been a long enough fight, that battle has worn on you. Maybe you've battled health problems. And you've battled them so long that it's become emotionally fatiguing, and you're not sure you can keep that fight up any longer. Maybe you are continually battling financial difficulties. You struggle under the burden, and it's become stressful, and you're just not sure how much longer you can hold on. Maybe your battle is against responsibility anxieties. We can only fight those battles for so long before they wear us down and wear us out. Maybe our breaking point comes quickly and unexpectedly. unexpectedly, like it did with Elijah. At one moment, he was a man of great faith. He called for God to work a miracle as if he knew God was going to do it. And then suddenly, he was a man struggling with a faith crisis, laying in deep despair, hoping to die and just end it all. There's a lesson for us in this. Success is never final. In fact, life is a series of ups and downs, isn't it? It's like being on a roller coaster ride. Sometimes you're at the top and you feel like you're on top of the world, and sometimes you're down in the depths of despair. I have learned not to depend on the victories that I experience. I know they will not last. I know that I cannot live on the mountaintop indefinitely. That when I'm there, that there is only one direction my life is going to head sooner or later, and that's down, and I know it's coming. But I've also learned not to be too discouraged by my failures. Because just as I don't live on the mountaintop, neither will I live indefinitely in the depths. And I know that when I'm at my lowest point, it's only a matter of time before my life heads the one direction it can go from there, and that is up, and it is coming. Life is like that. It's a roller coaster. The goal, therefore, is just to stay on the ride. I don't really care much for roller coasters. Even though they are statistically safe, I don't like riding them. I did a little research on the safety of roller coasters, and I discovered that the statistics of you being injured on a roller coaster ride are only 1.3 in 1 million. Those are pretty safe statistics. I further read that very few roller coaster riders have ever been ejected on sharp turns or steep drops, which I find to be an odd fact because it feels like I'm going to be ejected every time I ride on one of those things. When I am finally talked into getting on a roller coaster, my goal is just to stay on the ride and wait it out. And that's how life is, isn't it? Ride out the highs and the lows, and it will all end well. But there's a greater lesson we learn from Elijah and this time in his life and his subsequent encounter with God. And it's this: when you are hurting, run to God for help. Let's pick up in the scripture where I left off with the verbal story of Elijah. In 1 Kings 19, beginning in verse 3. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better off than my ancestors who were dead." Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. God knows our frailty. God is patient with us in our weaknesses. He didn't scold Elijah. "Elijah, why'd you turn and run? Where's your faith? You saw what great power I demonstrated. Why couldn't you trust in me a little bit longer?" He didn't say anything that would call him to task. Instead, he provided for Elijah in his time of hurting and weakness. He provided him rest and nourishment and understanding. An angel with an understanding heart said, "The journey is too much for you." We can trust God with our weaknesses. Are you distraught, discouraged, depressed? There certainly is value in getting professional help, but most of us would do well to begin by telling God about our problems. It would be better for us perhaps to start out lying under a tree rather than lying on a psychiatrist's couch and talk to God instead. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Learn from me and find rest for your souls." That's what we need when we are in an emotionally or spiritually weakened state. We need rest for our souls. Sometimes the journey of life is too great for us to make in our own strength. We need help. We need revived in our souls. We need the spiritual nourishment that only God can provide. And God knows how to minister to us in our times of weakness. Let's go back and resume the story, picking up in verse 9 of that chapter. He went into a cave once he arrived at Horeb, that is. He went into a cave and spent the night, and the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to take my life too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" I don't think God's repeated question was verbal discipline for his prophet. I think God wanted Elijah to consider while he was there. Why are you here, Elijah? God had directed Elijah there. It took 40 days of hiking to get there. And once he arrived, then God asked, "What are you doing here?" God had led him to Mount Horeb for a reason. He wondered if Elijah knew why. I think I know why. Mount Horeb was a special place. Our text called it the mountain of God. That was where Moses had encountered God twice. Once in the burning bush, and once in lightning and thunder and thick dark smoke, as God with his finger etched the 10 Commandments onto stone tablets. So why there? I think it's because God was going to give Elijah what he needed at Mount Horeb, just as God had done for Moses. He was about to give him a vision of himself, like he had given Moses 600 years before. Moses was also discouraged and depressed when he was on Mount Horeb. He asked God, "Show me your glory," and God did, and that energized Moses. And God was going to give Elijah the same thing. And so Elijah watched as a damaging wind swept by. But God wasn't in it. And then an earthquake came, but God wasn't in the earthquake. And then there was a raging fire, but still no God. And then a gentle whisper. What was that about? We might view God as being in his all-powerful, almighty estate, that he is powerful and merciless in his judgment as he pronounces. He is the God of destructive forces, but God wasn't in any of those forces when he appeared to Elijah. He was, however, in the gentle whisper. That whisper was like the soft voice of a parent soothing a child's fears. That whisper was God's way of saying, "I understand, Elijah, and I will take care of you." Elijah demonstrated the classic symptoms of depression: isolation, fear, self-pity, feelings of worthlessness, a loss of hope. To overcome that depressed state, God reintroduced himself to Elijah. Elijah had seen the God of great power on Mount Carmel, the God who sent fire down out of heaven. Elijah needed more than that. He needed to find the God of gentleness, who draws close to us and speaks in quiet tones when we are hurting or frightened or demoralized. He needed to discover the God of whispers. On April 25th, 2003, 13-year-old Natalie Gilbert was scheduled to sing the national anthem before the Portland Trail Blazers basketball game. It was Game 3 in their playoffs against the Dallas Mavericks. Natalie had a beautiful voice, and she had sang that anthem many times before at other public engagements. But 20 seconds into the song, she forgot the words and froze. She was first embarrassed and then humiliated and looked as if she were about to cry as the laughter in the crowd began to increase at that comic moment. Just then, Maurice Cheeks, the coach of the Trailblazers at the time, walked over to her, and he put his arm around her, and he began to whisper the words of that song into her ear. That encouraged her, and she was able to powerfully belt out the rest of the song. In an interview, the coach later said, "I didn't want to see her out there all alone." That's what God does. He draws close to us. He whispers to us words that we need to hear. Why are you here, Elijah? Why are you here? The God of whispers has led you here. Do you know why? It's because God wants to reveal himself and his plan to you. He wants to strengthen you for what he knows will be a difficult journey ahead. Listen for his voice. His words are powerful and inspiring, and we need to hear them. But as important as that was, there was more to God's plan for Elijah, just as there is more to God's plan for us. More there to the way that he ministers to us than that in our times of weakness. When God asked Elijah that same question the second time, "Why are you here, Elijah?" Elijah answered it the same way that he had previously. We see that in verse 14. I'm not going to read it, but you can compare in your memory, and you might want to do so in your Bibles as well, word for word. He gives the same answer that he had previously. He was still stung by discouragement and depression, even after seeing the glory of God and hearing his caring voice. But this time, God responded differently. He had already shown Elijah how powerful he was, and he had shown Elijah how caring and close he was. He had already given Elijah time for rest and recovery, and now he was about to give Elijah something different, something he needed just as much. He gave him a vision of a future, the future that he held in his mighty hand. And he gave Elijah a renewed sense of mission, that Elijah was going to be a part of God's great future. God has a role for us to play in his great mission to this world. And when we are discouraged, when we find ourselves struggling in weakness, when we are overcome with some despair or fear, God ministers to our souls, and then when he strengthens us, he re-enlists us once again to that role that he's called us to. Let's read the conclusion of this story in verses 15 through 17. Then the Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. And when you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu." He was calling Elijah back again to service. We are called to service. That is a part of our purpose as God's people. When we are in service, when we are fulfilling the role that He has planned for us, that gives us a sense of fulfillment, and it strengthens us. God called Elijah to this important ministry, a ministry which would answer his fear and depression. He was to appoint 2 kings and Israel's next prophet, and each of them would play a role in ending the reign of that evil king and queen who had threatened Elijah and had misled the nation. Those would have been words of encouragement to Elijah's ears. He would be a part of God's great mission still. God's future was still optimistic, and Elijah had a role in it. And doesn't God show us the same thing? I am so encouraged by the victorious future I see for this church. I see this church larger and healthier than it has ever been, and it is still growing weekly. And I know that God is working powerfully here. I see our teenagers return back from church camp or retreat with a spiritual fire blazing in their souls. And I know that God is building leaders for the future. I see our children's ministry continuing to grow, and that our children are being grounded in the faith, taught by great leaders and teachers. And I know that God is growing the faithful of the next generation. I see elders planning to lead this church to the next level, and I know that a progress-minded leadership will take us the right direction. I see weekly offerings which consistently exceed our budgeted needs, and I know that financing new programs will never be a problem as we grow. In the 35 years I have ministered to this church has never sat back and basked in victory. We have instead always continued to look forward to the next one. And as a result, we have never plateaued and stagnated. We are a thriving church. And I know that it is God who is leading this church into the future. And that future is one of victory, no matter who He is using in a leadership role here. After all, in Israel, if it wasn't going to be Elijah, it would be Elisha. For it was actually the power of God at work. And I know here, if it isn't going to be me at the helm, it will be someone, because it is the power of God that is at work. How encouraging for us to be a part of that. God has called us here. He has led us here for a reason. If you have trouble motivating yourself due to feeling distraught, discouraged, depressed, follow the same prescription God gave Elijah. First, take care of your physical health. Get rest when you need it. Make sure you have good nutrition. Get medical treatment if that's what's required. And secondly, take care of your spiritual health. Spend time in God's presence. Be inspired by His glory. Remember that He is the God of great power. And then finally, and not the least, fulfill your calling in God's kingdom. Get involved in some ministry. Fulfill that sense of purpose that God has placed in your heart. As Christians, we do get discouraged. We do suffer depression. But we don't give up. For it is the nature of our faith to rely on the God of great power. It is the nature of our commitment to align ourselves with His will. And we know, as Jesus taught us to pray, His will shall be done, and His kingdom will come in power. And you are a part of that. You are a part of the kingdom that cannot be shaken. God has led you here for a reason. Find your purpose and find fulfillment in it. And when you are weak, when you are distressed, when you are discouraged or depressed, distraught, run to God and find renewed faith in Him.